Thank you very much, and thank you for showing the slides. So very happy to be with you today. So I work in DG Regio of the European Commission, and I will make a short presentation to highlight some of the crucial aspects of the Just Transition Fund, the regulation, but also what we expect in the European Commission from the territorial just transition plans. In the next slide, please, you can see, and I think it's important just to highlight very briefly that the Just Transition Fund and the Just Transition Mechanism is an initiative in the context of the European Green Deal, which is the #1 objective of this European Commission, and which aims, and I think it's important to emphasize, to a climate neutral Europe. So you speak of decarbonisation, but it's very important to have this common objective in mind, that it's about climate neutrality in 2050. And one of the objectives here is to leave no one behind. Next slide, please. And this is why we have the Just Transition Fund, which is really, in our view, mostly meant to leave no region in Europe behind, to make sure that everyone not only is with us in the climate transition, but also that everyone and every region can benefit from this transition. And this is why cohesion policy is the overall framework where the Just Transition Fund will be implemented in. In the next slide, you can see, and I think then the presentation following mine will also speak about this, is that the Just Transition Fund is one of the 3 pillars of the Just Transition Mechanism. So the Just Transition Fund in itself has 17.5 billion, but if you add the national co-financing, the possible transfers that can happen, and also the other 2 pillars of the Just Transition Mechanism, this mechanism is expected to leverage between 65 to 75 billion euros in the coming years. I should also say here that the Just Transition Fund regulation will most likely be published at the end of June, together with the other elements of cohesion policy, and will then be in force in July. I think this is important to mention. So speaking about the Just Transition Fund, where will it go to? In the next slide, so this is just the allocations, how the 17.5 billion has been distributed as part of the budget negotiations to each of the member states. And in the next slide, which types of regions or territories will actually benefit from the JTF. So, and it's very important that we keep in mind that this is a big difference with the other cohesion policy funds, which will be spent in all EU regions. The JTF will only be spent in a relatively small proportion of regions, which still needs to be negotiated with each of the member states. But the JTF can only go to regions that that are the most negatively affected by the social and economic consequences of the climate transition. And so these are regions like the coal regions, but not only, who are dependent on fossil fuel extraction and production, but this is also about peat, lignite, oil shale, for instance, but also, and it's important to note, although the event today is not really about this, it's also about regions who are heavily dependent on carbon-intensive industries, which we, of course, do not want to see decline or phase out or disappear, like the fossil fuel extraction and production, but who will face a very deep transformation in order to be in line with the climate neutral transition. So in the next slide, you can see where the Commission has proposed in its initial analysis, which was published in the beginning of 2020, which types of regions, so fossil fuel on the left side, the carbon intensive on the right side, in each of the member states, according to our analysis, should receive JTF support. And in the next slide, you can see this on the map. So this is what the Commission has initially recommended. And it's on this basis that we are now negotiating with each of the member states the exact scope of the support. So in some of the member states, it's already very, very clear that we go with these regions as such. In other member states, there are still discussions ongoing on possibly extending slightly the geographical scope of support, and this will be done in the context of the negotiations on the territorial just transition plans, which I will speak about. But it's still crucial to underline one of the key elements of the JTF is that it's a relatively small fund in comparison to other EU funds. It has a very narrow thematic scope, which I will also speak about, but also in our view, it needs to still have a very targeted geographical scope to go really towards the regions most negatively affected by the transition to climate neutrality. So in the next slide, I turn to the territorial just transition plans, so the TJTPs, which we are now discussing with member states. Obviously, because the Just Transition Fund regulation has not been published yet, we have not adopted or approved any of these plans. So at the European Commission side, we have already seen drafts of several plans, but for some member states, we have not received these documents yet. But it's important to underline that we are still fully discussing and negotiating the content of these plans, also their geographical scope, and we have not approved anything yet. And it's important to stress what we are looking for in these plans. What is the intervention logic? So first of all, we need to see which territories are proposed for support in these plans, and these territories need to really face severe challenges as a consequence of the transition to climate neutrality. And that means that, for instance, in each of the territorial just transition plans that we will approve, we need to see a description of the transition process at national level with a timeline that refers to the, what will happen with either the declining or the transforming sectors. This timeline needs to be in line with the 2030 target, so with the 2050 climate neutrality target. And then at territorial level, so the territory that will be covered by the plan in question, we need to see that there is really a transition process being implemented, which has already an impact on these territories, social, economic impact primarily on these territories by 2030 or before. So this is a very, very important first step that we need to see in each of the plans. And then as a consequence of knowing what the transition process will be and which impacts are being felt already at the territorial level, these plans need to outline what exactly the challenges are in these territories, what their needs are, and then only in a final step, the plans will outline what kind of support actually is needed and which parts of that support will then be funded potentially by the Just Transition Fund. So this is important. As I said, most of the member states are now preparing these plans. 18 member states have requested support offered by the European Commission, DG Reform in particular, for the development of these plans, and this is now running to an end. So we are hoping to see many of the plans soon. In the next slide, this shows what the Just Transition Fund can actually support. So this is also an important difference with regard to the other cohesion policy funds. In the Just Transition Fund, we have a limited list of what can be funded. And in this limited list, it is very important to know that the primary objective of the Just Transition Fund is to alleviate the impacts of the climate transition. So in this context, I think it's still very important to highlight that the Just Transition Fund is not a fund for the decarbonization. It's not a fund for the energy transition. For this, we have more and bigger funds. So the Just Transition Fund and its role in the European Green Deal is to alleviate the social and economic impacts of the transition. This is why what we will primarily fund with the Just Transition Fund is the economic diversification and reconversion of regions and the reskilling and job assistance for the workers and the people that are affected. As you will see in the Just Transition Fund regulation, there are several other things that are eligible that can be funded, like support to climate and environmental sustainability, and these will be funded, and this is why we need the the territorial Just Transition plans to see to which extent it is justified to meet the objective of the fund, which is meeting or alleviating the social and economic impact of the transition. So one thing is to know what is eligible under the JTF, and another thing is to know what will be accepted in each territorial Just Transition plan. In this context, also important to know that any kind of support to fossil fuels is completely excluded from the Just Transition Fund, and that also there are a certain type of projects that could be funded, like productive investments in large enterprises or investments reducing greenhouse gas emissions from ETS activities. These are two things that cannot be funded by, for instance, the European Regional Development Fund. In the JTF, it can be funded. There are a number of conditions, of course, attached to it. I saw, for instance, that there was already a question in Slido, like, can the JTF support hydrogen? So yes, so renewable and low carbon hydrogen could be eligible for support of the Just Transition Fund, but this does not mean that we will fund it in all of the cases. So for the JTF, we really need to see whether this type of investment, and this is true for everything, is justified in order to meet the social and economic impact on these specific territories. And this will, of course, be different in a coal region or in a carbon intensive region or in a sparsely populated region or in an island. So this really will be very, very different across all territories. And then I turn to the next, and this will be my final slide. So a few thoughts from having already seen some of the draft plans and some of the discussions. And here I really also want to specify that I coordinate the Just Transition Fund in a horizontal unit in DG Regio. I am not involved directly in any of the discussions with specific member states. For this, we have other colleagues. But so we have really seen that a lot of administrations, but also local actors are spending a lot of effort in the preparation of JTF, which we are very happy about. The support that has been offered by the Commission in order to develop the plans has been really used very well. And we have seen also high level of ambition in many cases. As you know, a few years ago, when we saw the national energy and climate plans, we saw a lot of commitments toward, for instance, phase out of coal. Since then, some member states have already increased and accelerated these ambitions. So all of this is very good to see. There is a willingness to learn from ongoing and past initiatives like the Coal Regions in Transition initiative. And there is also a reflection on how this can be used also for other types of territories like the carbon intensive regions. However, it's now that we are still, working on all of these plans, it's important to stress again that we really want all the relevant stakeholders to be fully involved in the preparation of the plans. This is true for all cohesion policy, but it's especially true for the Just Transition Fund, because the Just Transition Fund is really there to give a future to all of the regions in Europe after fossil fuels. And this is why the people who are there in that region, they really need to be, need to have a seat at the table. In some of the plans, this intervention logic that I described is not always super clear yet, and sometimes we still need to stress that the JTF is not there to fund the decarbonization as such. It's there to fund the social and economic consequences of this. And then maybe just to end that, because this is a good follow through to the next presentation, I think the complementarities with pillars 2 and 3 of the Just Transition mechanism should really not be an afterthought in the plans. So as I said, the JTF is 17.5 billion, but the whole Just Transition mechanism could be up to 75 billion. So we really need, and it's important to stress that the territorial Just Transition plans, they give the access to the 3 pillars. So they are a precondition for the 3 pillars. And so this is why for us, it is really very important to think from the beginning also how the support from these other 2 pillars will be used. So I think this is a crucial point to stress towards the end. And then I'd like to end with 2 minutes to spare.